let's talk about content-driven development, or why the Wysiwyg can be a trap. My name is Sean G. Wright. I'm a dev lead at Wired Views, a Kentico Xperience MVP. And you can see here a link to my blog, where I blog very regularly about Kentico Xperience and development topics. And I'm a founding partner of craftbrewingbusiness.com. I enjoy collecting vinyl records, mowing my lawn, and drinking craft beer. So, how do we develop our sites? Do we develop them technology first? We only use models, views, and controllers, and we MVC all the things. Do we develop architecture first, where we shun data access in the controller, and instead we create interfaces and use DI everywhere? Or do we develop content first, always considering content when we are making development decisions, which leads us to use Kentico Xperience to its fullest potential? I'd like to share some thoughts on this topic, the idea of content-driven development. The right constraints are liberating. The wrong constraints are limiting. And we'll see this idea repeated through the rest of my presentation. I think these two ideas are very important, and they lead to many conclusions, which I think are helpful in developing a Kentico Xperience site. So what is a Wysiwyg? It stands for what you see is what you get, and it's also known as a rich text editor. You can see here I have content and design that would be generated by a Wysiwyg. You can see I can change colors, positioning, I can make bulleted lists, I can even insert images and things like that. However, there's a number of reasons why we maybe should be wary of the Wysiwyg. It mixes content and design, and as we'll see, that can cause problems for us down the road. The design that we get out of a Wysiwyg is achieved through CSS and HTML that we might not write ourselves if we were to do it manually. And then it's also a what you see is what you get tool, but only sometimes. If the CSS of our site overrides those styles, then that's not what we're going to get. Also, if the content that's sourced from a Wysiwyg is used elsewhere on the site, then the layout of what we are seeing in the Wysiwyg might not be what we see on the site. So the Wysiwyg has no functional constraints. We can do anything we want with it. However, there are constraints with it. There's the be careful constraint, which we tell content editors when they're using a Wysiwyg, tell them to be careful and don't break the site. So they always have to keep that in mind when they're using it. There's the I have to view the source constraint. So it's a tool that gives us all this flexibility, but we have to use it a certain way by flipping to the source when something is broken in the Wysiwyg. And then content editors also need to be designers and developers, and that's a constraint. If they type some content and add some design in the Wysiwyg, do they then go and check that that content still looks good in different devices, different viewports? Do they go and revalidate all the places that content is used around the site? Probably not, but that's a constraint on using the Wysiwyg correctly or effectively. The problem with the Wysiwyg is that it combines design and content too early in the process of building out a site. It has all the wrong constraints, which gives us the wrong kinds of flexibility. And it's a trap because these wrong constraints end up limiting us, even though it feels like it gives us infinite flexibility. So if we aren't going to use the Wysiwyg, how do we build our sites? Well, we're going to build them content first. And if we aren't adding our design through the Wysiwyg, then how do site editors customize the page? Well, we'll use the MVC Page Builder, which I feel is uniquely and effectively designed for this task. So let's first talk about page types, which help us define our content structure. What defines the ideal page type? It should provide a clear series of steps for data entry. It should model the content structure that we are going to add to the site exactly. So if we have a page that has a certain number of bits of content, maybe 3 things that we want to display on the page, then the page type that models that content should have 3 fields for content entry. An ideal page type should also enable a flexible but appropriate set of content relationships. So we should be able to say this piece of content is related to this other piece of content, and that's defined in how the page type is configured. It should not contain any fields related to design, only content. We'll be able to customize design in other parts of the site, as we'll see later. And notice that these are all constraints. These are constraints on how we use a page type, but these are constraints that will lead us to the flexibility that we need when creating and organizing content. So content structure strategy is a spectrum from flexible to strict and not a binary choice. And this means that sometimes a Wysiwyg will be the correct tool. It exists on the spectrum, but we should realize where it is on the spectrum and try to align ourselves with the strict content side as opposed to the side where we mix content and design. Generic content structures are more reusable. If we were to have a call to action content structure, we're going to be able to use this in more places on a site rather than, or compared to maybe an About Us page. The About Us page, we're probably only going to use in one place, and that's on the About Us page. That content structure is specifically designed for that part of the site. Whereas a call to action, we'll probably use that on just about every page on the site because every page is going to want a call to action. More reusable content is harder to create initially because it takes more planning. It's easy to create a Wysiwyg, put it on a page, and let someone code up HTML, CSS, and content and just put it in there. The site will be built very quickly. However, none of that content is reusable. If you build a page with 20 custom fields, or page type with 20 custom fields, to store the content that we want to use in different places on the page, that content is reusable, but it's going to be difficult to reuse. So if we have 3 call to actions on a page and they each have text labels, and we want to reuse the third one, what does that mean when we're reusing that text label somewhere else on the site? Do we know what the content is that's contained there? I would argue that while this having a bunch of custom fields in a page type makes that content reusable, it's still not as flexible as we want to be. What we really want to do is we want to design a page, place the content where we want to go on it, and then decompose that into smaller reusable pieces of content. And then we want to aggregate those pieces of content together on the page. So let's talk about the content tree. This is where we define content hierarchy and relationships. What defines the ideal content tree? It should be easily navigable by content editors. It should have a predictable content hierarchy and predictable relationships. And that means that if you know that this content is stored in one part of the tree, then it's likely to be reused in these other parts. We want to constrain content for scaling the content management process. And this means that we want to be able to know where content is used. We want to be able to make sure that content stays organized. This is about quality of the content over time. However, the ideal content tree also should be flexible for scaling content growth because a site is not static. We want to add new features, new products, new landing pages. So we need to have something that fulfills both content management from a quality perspective and also content management from a creation perspective. And notice these are all constraints again, but these are the right constraints for a content tree that is going to grow well with a site over time. So using page type icons is a way that we can bring some nice benefits with a very small feature to the content tree. It makes the content tree more navigable. It makes it easy to identify different types of contents. And Xperience as a platform includes icons that we can use, and we can also customize those icons and add our own. We can also use allowed page types and scopes. So allowed page types give us a global predictable content hierarchy with strict parent and child relationships. Scopes allow us to refine those restrictions in very specific parts of the tree. So you can see here on the right in the image, I have a terms of use page. And this page is a basic content page as is defined on the left with these parent-child relationships. And what these two sets of screenshots are showing is that normally I'd allow for basic card containers and basic content pages below something like the terms of use page. But specifically in the terms of use page, I want to define a scope that says no additional content can be created here. The benefit of this is that it doesn't make sense to create more content underneath terms of use, but I want to be able to reuse that basic content page type. So content should be easily validated. This is called content governance. This aligns with the idea of scaling content management and ensuring the quality of that content over time. A Wysiwyg makes this difficult because it embeds the content with the design. So if I want to go and say fix a typo or a link, or I want to remove a section of content because it's revealing information that we don't want to announce yet for a site, this can be hard with a Wysiwyg. A content editor that needs to validate or govern that content is going to have to be wary of breaking the design when they do it. Sites driven by visitor navigation, they tend towards content trees, and this typically results in single-use content. So you have a tree where each piece of content is only used maybe in the parent above it or in its siblings. Whereas sites driven by marketing goals tend towards content graphs. And graphs have multi-use content where content is related to each other all over the site. And moving from a content tree to a content graph requires very reusable content, and very reusable content has to be design agnostic because we don't know where that content is going to be placed and exposed elsewhere on the site. It could be in very many places, all which have their own design constraints and design aspects. So if we want to align with maybe more marketing goals, then we're going to have to take a content conscious approach to the development of our site. Top level pages tend towards content aggregations of child and global content with little content of their own. And a good example of this are landing pages, where the landing page itself typically doesn't have much content. Instead, what we're doing is we're selecting content from elsewhere on the site in different combinations and then displaying it with different design aspects. Okay, let's talk about the page builder, which is all about, in my opinion, content presentation. But before we get to it, I want to note that we haven't seen any examples of code yet. We've looked at content strategy, but we haven't talked about development strategy or architecture. And that's because there's a lot of work to be done before we even get to coding. And if we take a tech-first approach instead of a content-first approach, we might miss out on all these ideas and all these approaches that will help us build a scalable site that's good, not just both from a technical perspective, but also from a content management perspective. So it's interesting what happens when we start to focus on content management and content-driven development and how that impacts our coding and development efforts. So let's define the page builder components. There are widget sections, which define, compose, and apply design to layout. So these really are ways of customizing the layout of a page. There are widgets, which compose content and design. And you'll notice that this is the first place where we actually want to take content that we have created in the site and apply design aspects to it. There are form components, which are the page builder version of Portal Engine form controls. These allow us to customize and configure all of the different page builder components that we can create. There are dialogues, and these are helpful when form components are too restrictive or don't allow us the flexibility of configuring options for these other page builder components. There are inline editors, which enhance page builder UX. They are not for content creation. And I want to stress this because I think this is an easy misconception, especially given some of the demos of how inline editors are used in Xperience. They can be used for content management, content creation, but I think we really should avoid that for some of the same reasons that we avoid using Wysiwygs for content creation. And then there's MVC Page Templates, and these are skeletons of all the other page builder components. So here are some tips for using widget sections. They take the role of wireframes in the page builder. So if you were to wireframe out a site and you were to identify different sections of that wireframe, typically those will align well with widget sections. They can be customized with properties as much as widgets can. So if you define some widget properties for the widget properties dialog and they let you change how the widget works in lots of various ways, don't forget that you can also do the same thing with widget sections. And these can help with customizing the layout of the page. We want to avoid creating or configuring content here for the same reasons that we don't want to do design configuration in the content structure or in the content tree. We want to avoid managing content here and focus on layout and design. So we probably wouldn't want to have a field that's like the title of a section, because that title is going to become isolated from content elsewhere in the site. Sometimes that's the route we're going to take, but we want to strive for the goals that we're setting out for ourselves, which are to keep content management in the content management part of the site and then keep content design in the page builder part of the site. Widget sections focus more on layout than design. So typically you'll have more options for configuring sections that are related to changing the structure of a page compared to maybe colors of a page. But of course, there's always going to be use cases where we stretch out the ability of widget sections and maybe the roles that they serve. So here's an example of a widget section called a grid. And this grid has a background color that we can switch. It applies the color to all the contents. It also has a dialog where we can configure multiple options for how the layout of the grid works. I think this is very powerful. It allows us to give a good user experience for someone that wants to use one of these sections to build out a page. And by using the dialog, we give them an interface for selecting options that feels intuitive. It's an interactive form. If we have more complex wireframes for a site, lots of different variations, this can mean that we end up with more sections that we have to create in code. However, section properties can help us consolidate layouts that are pretty similar into a single section. And we would then create something like a dialog that would lead the content editors towards configuring the right set of options to get the right result that they want on the page. So what defines the ideal widget? It should have intuitive configuration. All combination of options should be valid. We want a UX of interacting with widgets that leads to success. We want flexible design customization because this is where we are doing the application of design onto content. So we need to be able to handle all the different design options that are enabled by the site design. And we also want to be able to have a broad source of content selection here. That's because if we can pick from a huge set of content on the site and it all works with the same widget, then we'll end up with a widget that we reuse a lot on the site. And content editors will become used to using that widget and selecting the right combinations of options and the right source of content for building out potentially an entire page or an entire section of the site. And notice that these are all constraints. Some of these are content management constraints. So like intuitive configuration. We want something that a content manager is going to focus on. We also want flexible design customization. So that's a constraint on us as developers, because we have to make sure that the options that we are providing make sense and work well together. Some of these things are going to be hard to achieve, and some of these constraints work against each other, like flexible design, but a broad source of content selection, because some content might not be applicable for a certain design. This is the ideal widget. This isn't the widget that we're necessarily going to create every time, but I think these are goals that we should aim for when we are creating our widgets. So here's some tips for building out widgets. We want to focus on the page builder UX for content editors when creating a widget. The page builder is all about content management, user experience. It's a great user experience, being able to drag something onto a page, open up some dialogue, select some options, not have to write a single line of code. You can potentially build out an entire site with just widgets. So we want to make sure that the UX for the content managers is good, because they'll be here a lot when they are customizing a page. We can use labels, explanation text, and field order to give a better user experience. And we can also display preview-only error messages in a view if a widget is misconfigured. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, we have these constraints on us as developers to create this ideal widget. Sometimes we can't expose the right set of options that will always work well together. And if a content editor picks some options that maybe aren't appropriate together, then we can display an error message that will only show up when you're in the edit or preview mode. They won't show up on the live site, to alert the content manager that, hey, you need to come over here and check this out. One common use case for this is if you are selecting a page in the page selector to be the source of content for a widget, and that page ends up getting deleted. Well, we don't want to display an error on the public site, but we do want to tell a content editor that if they are browsing around in the page builder of different pages, and those pages have widgets that reference the deleted page, that there's something wrong and they need to address that. We want to aim for high widget reuse within a site first, and then worry about reuse between projects. So the infinitely flexible widget, it's a great goal. I think it's difficult to achieve because of the fact that widgets are great for customizing design, and design tends to be specific to each site. That means that we can often reuse ideas behind how we're building widgets, but the widget code itself will typically need to be changed from site to site, or at least the views. If you can build a widget that can be reused across all sites, fantastic. I'd love to see that shared in open source, and I think the community could do great things if we all collaborated on these types of widgets. But your first use case is going to be widgets that you can reuse on multiple pages throughout a site, that reuse the same maybe type of content and apply the same sets of design configuration that are specific to that site. Content-specific widgets can be just as useful as content-agnostic ones. So a content-agnostic widget would be, for example, a widget that had a call to action, showed a call to action. It doesn't matter what type of content is going in there, as long as it's a call to action content, or maybe something that showed a list of pages. Every single page has a name, and so you could just list out those names. A content-specific widget would be one that, if you, let's say you had a e-commerce site that was about fishing equipment, and you want to display the featured fishing rod of the day. That could be a widget you could drop in various pages on the site as a call to action to push people towards buying products. And that's very specific. It's a very specific use case. But if it helps marketers and content editors achieve their goal, then you should create that widget. There's nothing wrong with that. So here's some other tips. If we have advanced use cases for widgets, then custom form components and dialogues are going to be the tools we're going to reach towards. If we have a simple widget, we probably aren't going to use these, and that's okay. They're there for when we need them. If we have a widget with very complex configuration, then a dialogue that's based on a JavaScript rendered or interactive form, that can be a great solution. Also, the dialogues and to some extent form components give us full control over the page builder UX. And so again, if we're trying to focus on UX for content editors, these tools will help us achieve goals of high quality. So here's an example of a widget that allows us to select content from the tree and then gives us a dialog for customizing the design of that widget. Because the content is separated from the design, we can pick any content that is appropriate for this widget and not worry that the design customization we're applying to that content is going to conflict with design that's baked into the content itself. It also means that we can display the same content in different places on the site with different design applied to it. And you can see here, I'm using a dialog to give a great UX for content editors that are looking to customize how the content is displayed on the site. So this is what I call a card widget, and I think every site should have a card widget. How you create the structure of that card is going to be specific to your use cases. But I think that it's a common enough use case that you should consider it when you are designing content and widgets and all these pieces and parts that come together to take a content-driven design approach for a site. When widgets are constrained to interacting only with or customizing design for a page, they reveal new possibilities of how they might be used. And I think this widget is a great example of maybe something that's not demoed a lot, or maybe not part of the documentation about how to create a widget, but it's been proven to be very flexible for our team. So let's talk about inline editors real quick. Here's an example of an inline editor that allows you to switch between different transformations for a specific content type. It's great for improving the UX of content composition on the page. There's less context switching. I don't have to open up a new dialog to change between different designs for this content that's being displayed. However, inline editors can be easily abused, especially if they're used for content management, because what we end up doing is using things like in-page Wysiwygs and image uploaders. So why is the page builder inline editor so troublesome? Well, because the content can't be isolated once it's in that Wysiwyg, once it's in the page builder. It can't be reused. And the content management is then performed in different places, which leads to poor UX. Content governance also becomes more difficult because we don't know where the content is managed, and we have a hard time separating the content from the design. And what happens when the CSS is updated or the widget is moved? It might break how that content is displayed and it no longer looks good. So MVC Page Templates, these are used for major structural layout changes with predefined variations. They basically let a content manager select a view for a page. And they can improve the UX of creating new pages when we use custom MVC page templates. They name a selection of sections, widgets, and property values, so you can get started creating a new page very quickly. You can think of them as being one level higher than sections and widgets in the page builder hierarchy. And here's an example of using an MVC page template. It results in less configuration for content managers with a huge effect on how the design and layout of the page is set up. And it's easy to add new page templates in the future for more customization. So you can start out with just one and then grow that as you come up with new design and widget options. So in summary, we don't want to cross the streams of content design until the very end. And that's because these things aren't easily separated. And the Wysiwyg goes against this idea of keeping design and content separate. We don't just want to build sites. We want to build solutions for the people that are using those sites. Keep content managers in mind. Build tools and parts of the site with good UX. We want to focus on content from the beginning. And remember that the technology of experience helps us achieve goals, but it's not a goal in and of itself. So thanks for joining me, and remember to use your Wysiwyg wisely the next time you decide you want to put it in your site.